but we are at a time where there's a lot of uncertainty around baseball, and I do think the Cubs are in a pretty like stable position to where they can make those decisions and take on more risk to get some of that star level talent you need in October.
Hey, what's up, Setup Nation? We have got another episode of Rumor Has It, and very excited to have Patrick Mooney on the show. He's the senior writer for The Athletic. We're going to be talking about the Cubs today. Quick backstory, guys. I was actually at a Giants game. That's how Patrick and I met. And that was like, Patrick, the game. I talked to you and I was like, yeah, Stroman was pitching that day. We were both like, yeah, he's not on the team in a couple months here. And every single stat that came out for like the rest of the year was dating back to that June 9th game that I met you at, and how the Cubs have the best record or one of the best records since June 9th. So, I mean, I'm giving us some credit. We kind of sparked them a little bit.
Well, I do love, it's called Oracle Park now. So I always space, that is, one of, if not my favorite stadium in baseball, and the press box there is very close to the field and open air and just an awesome environment. And yeah, that was, Cubs had just been swept in Anaheim. We were all assuming they'd be selling at the trade deadline. The Cubs did regroup that night with Stroman. They had a couple kind of meetings to refocus, and I think the next day Kyle Hendricks almost like took a no-hitter maybe into the 8th inning, if that sounds right. And so just a very, and especially unpredictable season around the Cubs when you look at certain snapshots like that first night in San Francisco to the trade deadline to just an epic collapse at the end of the season.
There are so many things surrounding this team this offseason. I want to start with the biggest clickbait out there is Ohtani right now, right? Mm-hmm. And yesterday we just heard that the Rangers are out, apparently, an AL East team is out, apparently, and it's seeming more and more like there's probably 3, 4, maybe a 5th team that is down to the wire here, and the Cubs being one of them. Dodgers, Giants, Blue Jays, maybe the Angels are still in play. It feels like there's a real shot at this point, and you keep hearing some of these other rumors of this is the Cubs' number one priority. Do you see this being the priority? And also, what happens if they don't get Ohtani?
Well, look, I think the most people, there are very select few who know what Ohtani wants. And I have, I would not trust a lot of the information out there. I think a lot of it is kind of like some guesswork and piecing things together. And, this is ultimately driven by what Ohtani wants. He can sort of name his destination, name his price. This is a kind of a once in a lifetime negotiation, a very unusual situation. We know the Cubs are going to be in this for as long as they can. We know that he decided to meet with him a while ago. And so, sorry, when he first came over from Japan. So I think you kind of have to let this play out. Like the way, this is not a normal free agency where you kind of hear stuff here and there, or you can kind of get a better read on what the player wants. Like this is kind of totally shrouded in mystery. And I think the Cubs kind of went into this knowing it's a long shot because most of these big deals are. And, from there, there's so many different ways that they can pivot.
Yeah. Well, and one of those ways that they can pivot, especially with Cody Bellinger looking like he's probably not returning. At least that seems to be the whispers. It seems like Pete Crow-Armstrong is really going to be the guy in center field, even if Bellinger does return, a chance that he goes to first base and PCA is in center field. How much pressure is there on guys like PCA, Alexander Canario, and especially Cade Horton coming up if the Cubs don't make some big splashes this offseason? Huge potential in the farm system, but it feels like if these Cubs are going to rely too much on the farm system, that there could be added pressure for the 2024 season.
Well, I mean, pressure is just a part of it. I do think the Cubs will be transactional to try and move some of their minor league pieces to get major league talent. I think with Pete Crow-Armstrong specifically, his September call-up, showed he still has, some learning to do.
Yeah.
And I think the Cubs, whenever they bring him up, will want him to bat ninth and focus on defense, and try to give him some runway that way versus being like, you're the franchise savior. I think it's trying to create something similar to how Javi Baez came up and was able to move around and make contributions with his defense and his base running and kind of grow into and earn larger opportunities. And, another unknown with this too is, how is Craig Counsell going to manage this team? And that's not a knock on David Ross and young talent or kind of inexperienced guys. We saw Justin Steele emerge as an all-star Cy Young candidate this year, and Ross definitely was in his corner. You saw them rebuild bullpen on the fly. He certainly trusted Nico Horner to grow into a Gold Glove defender and really a foundational piece for this team. So I think I'm not expecting to go to spring training in February and, the Cubs are only pointing to their prospects. I would expect, multiple significant additions to the major league roster.
Cool. I mean, especially with them having, 6 of the top 100 prospects, it feels like there's going to be some version of a trade this offseason as well. There's some really good starting pitching on the free agent market, but in terms of position players, you've got Ohtani, you got Bellinger, you got Chapman, and that feels like it's about it. A lot of third baseman trade rumors, a lot of first baseman trade rumors. What actually has some legs on it that you see being a real possibility? We've heard Bichette, we've heard Vlad, we've heard Pete Alonso. What is actually something that you could see being realistic? And what do the Cubs have to give up in your mind to get something like that?
Well, I believe my colleague at The Athletic, Ken Rosenthal, reported that Toronto trading their core hitters is unlikely when they want to win next year. But I do think it's still unanswered. Where will Christopher Morel play? Where will he fit? There are certainly teams that could be interested in him as a low-cost guy that could play him at second base, which is probably his best position, and he's not going to supplant Nico Horner. I mean, the Cubs have been looking into all these possibilities, and that's probably the biggest idea I would underline this offseason, that they can do. They'll be in the deal flow for just about anything. And Kyle, you and I were talking about this before we started recording. They kind of need, at least one more, legit starting pitcher, and they'll probably get more depth beyond that. They need to revamp their bullpen. They don't have an obvious opening day starter at first base or third base, so they have some options there. Replacing Cody Bellinger in center field, maybe there is some combination of Crow-Armstrong, Canario, Mike Tauchman, but again, it'll be interesting to see how Craig Counsell weighs in on this, because the Brewers were a very good mix and match team for a while, and he has worked in the front office before and will have sharp insights into how the Brewers viewed the Cubs and really got the best of the Cubs in recent years. And you have a ton of money available, money coming off the books after this year, and really the pieces to make just about any deal you'd want.
I know Christopher Morel's name has been out there in trade talks. I know that there's also a hole at third base. And from a fan's perspective, you see the Cubs having a hole at third. You see this electric bat. You see this high ceiling in a guy like Morel, electric energy as well. And it just seems like, well, that's where he was coming up in the minors as well. Third base, second base. Why not give him a shot, especially after a year where they gave Nick Madrigal a shot? Do you just think the Cubs front office basically says they don't see the potential for Morel at third?
That's a great question. I feel like last year Morel was a little bit of an afterthought, and or the organization just didn't see it. That everything that goes into playing third base, there were just kind of questions on multiple levels on like, can Morel do this at a really high level every day right away? And now Nick Madrigal, to his credit, transformed himself into a capable defensive third baseman last year.
That was impressive.
Last offseason, I should say, that he put in the work on the front end. But obviously with him, you don't have the power that comes with Morel's game, and also there are injury questions. So this is maybe not a Morel specific answer, but I do wonder sometimes of like, when a player is in an organization for such a long time, that maybe there are thoughts or ideas about what a player can and cannot do, and maybe another organization would have a different perspective. So all I know is that like Christopher Morel has, a combination of skills that is really hard to find. He brings great energy. He's an entertainer and has a great attitude about things. So I think all of those factors means we're probably going to hear his name in trade rumors up until wherever he reports to spring training.
I agree. Well, one of the reasons that this team had just such an epic collapse at the end of the year was the bullpen. Injuries seemed like a lot of overuse potentially. They were putting on a clink for how to blow a save by the end of the year. What do you think the front office does this offseason with this bullpen? It's been very much like, let's get the bargain deals the last few years. Let's get the veterans that maybe are trying to make a comeback. Do you think Hoyer gets a little bit more serious about getting a premium guy?
I don't think he's going to give like Josh Hader a 5-year, $100 million contract. That is very far outside his comfort zone and kind of what he views as a good allocation of resources. I do think he's softened a little bit in terms of saying, hey, maybe that 2-year deal does make a little more sense, even if it's not our first preference, but maybe paying for some security, some know-how, some experience isn't the worst idea. But generally speaking, I do think a big part of this is going to be one, going with volume. Like, you're not going to bat 1,000 on this, but say if you sign 5 or 6 guys between the 1-year deals, the minor league deals, waiver claim, you might get the next Julian Merriweather, who was a guy that no one was really talking about when that minor transaction was made. And then you have some of these prospects that we're talking about. Not all of them are going to be major league starters. Part of what Counsell and presumably Tommy Hotovy and the pitching group post Craig Breslow will be discussing is like, how do we fill these innings and how do we set up guys to succeed? And I think that's going to be a really interesting question of, I do think Craig Counsell is really good at pushing those in-game buttons, but he'd be the first to say like, having Devin Williams and Josh Hader makes you look a lot smarter. Like, no one was asking him about, why did you pitch Devin Williams in the 9th? Like, you don't, David Ross was put in a position where he kind of had to wear a lot of the issues that the Cubs had in pitching development years prior. And also, some of the misfires on relievers last offseason. So I think a way to help Counsell, a way to win some of those close games would be investing in the bullpen in different ways, for sure.
If today were to start the season, you'd have Justin Steele probably taking opening day after an amazing 2023. You got Kyle Hendricks and Jameson Taillon. And then after that, it's kind of a crapshoot. Javier Assad, seems like he could fit a role there, but it feels like this team needs to get not only another starting pitcher, but a number 1 or number 2 kind of guy. And then there's still that question of potentially a 5th spot, especially if there's any injuries. So do you think they go internal for both of those, external for both of those, a mixture of both? Where do you see the Cubs going in terms of starting pitching this offseason?
I mean, they're definitely looking for external solutions. Like, I don't, expect them to win a bidding war for Yamamoto, but Marcus Stroman's decision to opt out opened up kind of $21 million that was devoted to the rotation. And, I think they know that you can never have enough pitching. That's one of Jed Hoyer's like pet catchphrases that he often likes to repeat. And I really think what they're looking at is probably at least one established guy, more depth, and like knowing that asking Jordan Wicks or Javier Assad to throw 200 innings is just not going to happen. And Cade Horton is super talented, but doesn't have a ton of experience. And whatever they line up in Arizona when pitchers and catchers report is not going to be the group that leaves for opening day or that makes it to the All-Star break, much less September. So I do think you can see multiple additions, and also the council factor again of like, someone like Hayden Wesneski who has talent, has shown it in flashes. Like, how do they kind of tap into that and get him to repeat those really nice moments over and over again, and deploy him in the right spots, and what role? There's just a lot of unanswered questions that they'll be going over this offseason.
Two more questions on that. You mentioned you don't see the Cubs winning a bidding war on Yamamoto. A big market team like this, especially one that's been talking to Ohtani, where do you come from when you say you don't see them winning a bidding war on him?
I would just say that if you look now, Ohtani may wind up being the exception because he's kind of this unicorn. I'm setting him aside that if you want Ohtani, you have to be prepared to do whatever it takes.
Sure.
I think if you just look at last year's shortstop class, like who did the Cubs sign and on what terms? And it wasn't a 13-year deal. Dansby's Swanson's contract for them was fairly rational. And I think that's how Jed Hoyer kind of approaches these things, of where can the Cubs find value, where can they find upside, where can they limit their risk. And Yamamoto is another one too, where it's hard to decipher like what's misinformation, what's like good hard reported information. Like, he's another one who can kind of like name his price and his destination, and it is, at least to me, not entirely clear like, oh, like he has to have the Cubs and he's going to have a ton of great options, and kind of we'll see where he lands.
So, you look at these deals, right? Especially last year that were signed with Bogarts and Turner, and the Cubs are very happy they don't have like a Steven Strasburg type of contract on their books, right? But also this club in its entire history has never put in a contract of over $200 million. And it feels like this rationale mindset of calculated risk makes a lot of sense for the long run. But at some point, you also have to kind of catch up to the market, don't you? And start making some calculated risks if you really want to get some of those big fish. Do you see Jed Hoyer, and again, taking Ohtani and putting him to the side because he's a unicorn, right? Do you see Jed Hoyer in the front office ever saying, hey, we've got to just take a big risk, even if this ends up going the wrong way for us?
Yeah, and I think they kind of tiptoed towards that. They did spend more than $300 million on free agents last offseason. Like, I don't think they thought Jameson Taillon was going to get 4 and 68. Like, that was but to your point, that was more of like a mid-range starter than a guy at the top of the market. And we saw this at last season's trade deadline, of them not wanting to go over the luxury tax threshold, in part because of the baseball related penalties in terms of like the draft and bonus pools and the international market. And this is my read on the situation more than like hearing it directly, but I think that concern has been downplayed at this point. And part of it last summer was they didn't really see that game-changing talent to do that, because the financial penalties in terms of dollars are relatively minimal. And I think they are approaching that moment now where it would make a lot of sense to go back over the luxury tax threshold again. And if you get some of these prospects that we've mentioned or others we haven't, whether it's Matt Shaw or Ben Brown, like if you have that base of young talent making close to the major league minimum, you can take more of those risks. And sure. I also think the Cubs are getting farther and farther away from some of the moves that were, I don't know if I'd even say regret, because Jose Quintana helped them get back to an NLCS. Jason Hayward helped them win a World Series. But I do think as you kind of cycle away from some of that, I do think things kind of come back around to where you say, hey, sign John Lester too. I think that might have been the biggest deal in franchise history at that time. And then the next offseason, you top that with a Hayward deal, because he checked so many boxes that they thought it was relatively low risk. You just kind of never know. But we are at a time where there's a lot of uncertainty around baseball, and I do think the Cubs are in a pretty like stable position to where they can make those decisions and take on more risk to get some of that star level talent you need in October.
All right, Patrick, before we log off here, any other whispers, trade rumors, free agency talks that you're hearing about for the Cubs that people want to hear about?
I'm hearing some things. I'm not quite ready to put it on the podcast yet because I don't. Okay. But I do think things are happening behind the scenes. I do think we've already seen some pitchers make decisions here. I think the winter meetings will be a pretty good TV show. I think there'll be a lot of action there. It won't be one of those like where people are standing around waiting for things to happen. Like I do think there'll be a flurry of activities, and the Cubs, like we just talked about for the last 20 minutes or so, are going to be in the middle of all that because they've created all these opportunities and possibilities.
Okay. Patrick Mooney, he's keeping his lips sealed on some of these deals that he's hearing. But if you want to be one of the first to hear about any Cubs deals, make sure to check out Patrick on Twitter. Patrick, thanks for jumping on the Setup Man podcast with our side segment, Rumor Has It, to talk about the Chicago Cubs offseason. I appreciate you.
You got it, Kyle. Take care.